Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening if you're watching this from across the ocean. My name is Carmine Starnino, and I'm the poetry editor and associate publisher of Véhicule Press here in Montreal. I want to welcome you all to the launch for Nectarine by Chad Campbell. While a lot of us, my colleagues at the press included, are eager for the day when we can go back to in-person events, one of the things I love about these virtual launches is that we can beam in guest readers from almost anywhere in the country or the world, which allows us to do something more than launch a book. It also helps celebrate that book and the literary friendships that have provided support and counsel. So in that sense, we're joined by two fantastic poets from the United Kingdom who are friends of Chad, Francis Leveston, who lives in Northumberland, and Joe Carrick Vardy, who lives in London. They're going to help me tease out some of the elements that make Nectarine such a terrific collection. After I'm done talking, I'm going to bring in Chad, who will read some poems and talk to me about the book and the work that went into writing it. Then we'll switch to Francis and Joe, who will read some of their own poems. And then I'll bring Chad back briefly to read again. And then we'll move on to the question and answer period. I encourage you all to post your questions wherever you may be streaming this on Facebook or YouTube. We will be watching those comments, selecting the best question, and one of you will win a free copy of the book. That said, you can order your copy of Nectarine directly from us at our website. We post orders the very same day, and yes, we will deliver it to the UK. Good? Okay. Chad is the kind of poet who shouldn't really exist anymore. The kind of poet who, to quote the late critic Ian Hamilton, redignifies the bardic stance. If you want to learn about toxic masculinity, post-colonialism, or the climate crisis, then his poems might not be for you. He writes the kinds of poems for which terms like ravishing were intended. He thinks deeply about the poems, the way his poems sound and the shapes they take. In our editing, he has been troubled for days by a single verb tense. He plots his word choices precisely and sumptuously. Nothing in his poems is there by accident, and if it is there, it has likely been guided by principles of beauty, form, and music. His first book, Laws and Locks, appeared in 2015, and it was an investigation into the arrival of the Campbell clan in Canada in 1827. It tracked the history of his family and its struggle with depression and, at times, madness. It was incandescently good writing, full of thrilling wordplay. The poet Tim Lilburn called the poems muscled and big-boned, comparing them to Robert Lowell's early bravura work. Law and Locks was essentially a book about memory, what we choose to remember from the past, and the ritualizing role that poetry can play in that. The poems in Nectarine turn that around slightly. They are focused on the present moment and how the past dwells in those moments. But the poems are still haunted by memory to spellbinding effect. They are startling and intense, packed with unforgettable images. At times, I feel like I'm reading gorgeous fragments of some mysterious Old English epic. Chad was a finalist for the 2013 Malahat Long Poem Prize, and Law and Locks was nominated for the Gerald Lampert Award, given for the year's best debut. His poems have appeared in journals across the UK and Canada, and are anthologized in The Next Wave and Carcanet New Poetry's 8. Originally from Toronto, he is a graduate of the Toronto Writers' Workshop and has lived and taught in Iowa. He lives in Manchester now, where he studies and teaches at the Center for New Writing. Chad?
Hi.
Hey,
Thanks.
how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction.
My pleasure. So, so I thought what we would do is maybe talk a bit and have you read while we talk, and maybe do something a bit different. So my first question is really about the stretch of time between Law and Locks and Nectarine. What you were thinking and doing in that period. You wrote to me at one point, that you wanted the new poems to turn more toward the world, and that you were going after subjects that seemed to need, as you put it, different approaches. So what what does that mean? What did that mean? And can you read a couple of poems that demonstrates those new approaches?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like Laws and Locks as a collection, and like you said, there was an awful lot of looking back in that collection, looking back on my own life, and then sort of like looking back through the history of the family. And so I guess I sort of thought of like the sort of inkwell of that book was largely memory, and it was largely history. And I ended up honestly just spending a lot of time with ghosts, like writing that book. And so like by the time I'd sort of I'd gotten to the end of that and spent 5 years writing that collection, like it wasn't so much that like I felt like sick as like almost just kind of like tired. I'm like I can't sort of keep on going speaking to the dead and being in the past. And so yeah, I think that's where those conversations that we had came from, where all I knew was that I needed to find ways to kind of turn towards the world. And in terms of approaches, it meant that I was kind of abandoning like research as a big part of writing my poems. And so I did all kinds of really weird things. Like, one of the poems I'm about to read is about a sea snail. And I would just spend an afternoon watching like videos of these little creatures in the ocean, just kind of, like floating along. Or I would go and like lay in a field and imagine, as weird as this sounds, that I was like laying next to a pheasant, which is the first poem that I'm going to read here. So like there was a lot, I suppose, of just me trying to just become intimate with the world around me. And I needed to find those things that kind of felt natural to me, like some sort of live wire of connection.
That sounds good. Yeah.
So I guess I can start with a couple of animal poems.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this first poem is called The Pheasant. The Pheasant. The pheasant bled out in a field of heather. I heard the black wing door open over the fields, the awful leather flap of feathers, even as the stroke of an oar. His irises growing wider in the sunlight, as a statue by the fire seems to look toward the fire. Because I remember a time before I held myself apart, I lay beside the pheasant in his bed of heather, panting in the brightness, not alone, but together. So this next poem is called Sea Snail, and these creatures are also known as pteropods or sea angels, and they're basically completely translucent. So you can like see them floating, and they're blue, and you can see their little hearts kind of pulsing. And they're having real trouble right now because they're born in these little shells made of calcium, and the acidifying oceans are making it hard for those to develop. So this poem, Sea Snail, was written for sea snails. Sea Snail. Who comes rising on the water column at night? 6 translucent horns dusted orange, pale blue, pewter. This one, glob of sun, honey nebula, fragile who, if the moon rises abruptly, will abandon her mouth and fall below the waves. And waves. When it is night and farther into night the night goes, she phosphors, blue lip body tracing chalk eons in figure eights. An altered ocean corrodes her, her violet shield, the once inviolate heart flaring a bit further into night the night goes.
Thank you, Chad. It's funny. There aren't that many poems in your first animal poems in your first book.
No.
And this Nectarine has the sea snail and the pheasant. It has a lot of birds in it.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Is the presence of all the animals sort of a function of you paying more attention to the world because you want to free yourself now from having to remember the dead, Or, you know, are the animal poems, were they always a function of how you wrote? So are you returning to something that was always sort of an interest for you? Or is this something newly discovered?
I mean, I think the answer might be that it's a little bit of both. Like, when I was a kid, and particularly, the times that I spent in England, I guess I oddly always felt kind of close to animals, and I don't know how to kind of explain that much more than just that kind of closeness. But when I was sort of like thinking about what I might want to write for a new collection, um, you know, I guess I just made decisions. Like, I didn't want to write another mental health book. I didn't feel like I wanted to take a particular stance on sort of hot button issues, but I did want to find things that I felt sort of deeply about, and certainly the sort of ecological crisis that we're facing right now. That felt like something that I could approach, and something that I could write into. So there was a lot of reading, I guess, behind the animal poems, but when it actually came to writing them, it was just animal by animal.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that
Yeah.
leads to the other question I wanted to ask, which is the effect of coming back to England, and the effect that had on your work,
Yeah.
and how that. I mean, it's something that's, I guess, reflected in what you're just telling me now. How that ties into the, I don't know, sort of the Jake feel of the book. That you said to me. Sorry, I keep drawing on your emails to me when we were editing it because they're so rich with thinking. But you once said to me that time was more of a loop than a line. That was the thing that you were sort of, the idea of time being more of a loop than a line. And you tied that to sort of some insights you had when you returned to England. I'm just wondering, what that meant for you, what that means for you, and maybe give us a couple of poems that could serve as an example of that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, I feel like I'm going to fall short of my own emails here. But, like, I spent 3 years in England, stretched across summers when I was a boy, on kind of a little canal boat called Papagena with my grandparents and with my mom. And I think that, because I only ever came over here in the summers, that there was something that almost kind of preserved like a kind of England in almost like fossil form for me. And like, even though I would think about England like quite often, it was just kind of like trapped in amber or sort of frozen or something. And so, when I moved back here and I started doing things like going to the canal for the first time, or seeing a canal boat, or going to some towns that that I'd been to before, it wasn't just these kind of like passing memories that were coming back to me. It was this kind of feeling like two worlds were occupying the same space at once, and it often felt like there was almost like, I don't know, like a crack between the two worlds, and one was kind of pouring into the other. So I think like a lot of the poems were this kind of feeling like the present moment is somehow like a composite of memory and what's going on in that moment. And I guess a lot of my poems are trying to kind of capture some of that, but also pay service to that feeling of things looping back around on themselves. And of course, like, there was the literal looping back of like me returning to where I'd been before. It's terrible. I can't remember his name, but I remember going to an art gallery maybe 7 years ago in Canada, and this artist had made these little dioramas, and you could peer through like a little hole, and it would just be these kind of very ordinary scenes, like a hotel room or a kitchen or something. But he'd rigged up these little lights so that you could see little figures kind of like flickering across the floor, like getting out of bed. And I think that a lot of the poems in Nectarine like are kind of like that, where like, I kind of took a setting or a landscape, and then you have these excuse me, these figures kind of flickering inside them. So the first poem that I'm going to read here is called Tunnel Walking, and the figure in there, who is called the lock keeper, is actually sort of a composite of a lock keeper, a mechanic that I once met, and my grandfather. And so that's sort of like I guess the flickering figure in the diorama. And then the one that I'll read after that is me, I guess, kind of playing the loop forward, and just imagining me in my bedroom in Manchester, kind of sailing down the street on my bed. But I'll read Tunnel Walking first. Tunnel Walking. In a quarter-mile tunnel bored through the heart of a hill, the lockkeeper lifted me high enough to feel the stone our narrowboat slid under, like an arm through a sleeve. He said there used to be men who would lay on their backs, feet fit to the bricks of the ceiling, peddling coal through the dark. How steam would replace them, but not in time to save even one man falling from the roofs of the boats like meat from a bone. I stared down into the water. Pale faces stared back up. The lockkeeper sat in his basement, tracing his history back through the records, until the records gave way to a sound, I imagined, like the cool exhalation of air from the model train tunnels he'd cut into the walls. He hummed a song I recognized but couldn't place whenever we drank from the mugs for brushes he used to paint the miniature city behind his desk. When he flicked them on with a little white switch, I picture myself staring back from one of the tiny windows. I buried that sound when I was young. It pulses under the work I do, like the roar when you cover your ears, or the rain clouds above one of those men, laying in a bright field, practicing the sky forward as steam poured from his eyes like the shallow barrels of a gun. I think about him, about the last time I saw the lockkeeper, painting himself deeper inside his miniature city, singing in baritone as he fixed the moon to a wire. About the sound, like a forest heart after a storm, of water dripping through moss and loam, of voyages we make alone. Okay. Okay, and this next poem is called A Tin of Oranges. A tin of oranges. So this is what it will be like, the impression in the sheets. Ingot on ingot of silver blue air. Let there be at least a tin of oranges. I woke counting back in decades and stood behind a waterfall of objects falling out of touch. An ocean of shoes and loose clothing. The school bell on the windowsill, calling the ancient children home out of habit. Habit. The hands that reach through the bedroom dark part the air like curtains. But I was already sailing past my last day. The bed a berth in the hull of a ship on a sudden sea. My body folded like the clothes across my knee.
Oh, such beautiful poems, Chad. The last question before we move on to Francis and Joe is about memory. I've spoken a bit about it, and how I think I see it operating in your poems, and clearly the idea of it, both as a kind of general principle and as a poetic principle, I think. I mean, both as something that sort of guides you and something that you write by, has been there from the first book. But I'm curious to know what your theory of it is and how you see it operating, particularly in the new poems.
I mean, dear God, a theory of memory. I don't know that I've got one per se. I think that some of it definitely has to do with, like, I don't think of memory, I guess, as sort of like a discrete place. I think of memory instead as like part of the sort of available fullness of sort of any given moment. And that often the things that, I kind of want to write poems about, or the places that I return to when I sit down to write a poem, are these moments or these images where I just can't explain to myself why they feel so full, so pregnant. And I guess memory is just one of the layers that I'm trying to kind of expand or bring into those moments. And then, I just had this idea, I guess, writing the book, like thinking about how many glances we all have over the course of a lifetime. Like I almost imagined like literally like a little bag of like glances, you know? And so like every time
Define glance. What do you mean by glance?
Oh, I just mean literally like there are like flowers on my desk right now.
Yeah.
And so like I like there's a little glance of the flowers. And I just think like, you know, it's this kind of beautiful, like sad thing where it's like, you know, I'm giving one of my available glances to the flower and it sort of keeps it maybe. So like this idea that like we're always giving some part of ourselves to the world as we're seeing it. And sometimes I think the world kind of keeps it. So our memories are kind of locked in places. So I don't know if that's much of a theory of memory, but it was there for a lot of the writing.
Oh, it's lovely. Yeah. I mean, in a way, some poems are kind of collections of glances. Is that right? I mean,
And so poem wise, I'll read a short one. And this one was actually Yellow Pebbles. I wrote maybe the first week after I got back to England, and saw a canal boat again for the first time. And then the second one, I guess, is the closest thing I have to a title poem here, and it's called Portrait as Nectarine. And both of these, I guess, in their way, are kind of about glances and memory. Okay, so this poem is called Yellow Pebbles. Yellow Pebbles. 17 years away from the canal, mottled water, the sog rope fenders hatch, porthole Arcadias and each flame-headed marigold in its planter. I shouldn't have gone back there or filled my pockets with yellow pebbles from the towpath. I planted them in a glass on the desk, the rations of glances of you I didn't know I had left. Going to take a sip of my my tea. This next one is a bit of a long one. Okay, so this poem is called Portrait as Nectarine. I don't know that you need a lot necessarily for this one, other than I, for some reason, was looking up old advertisements for nectarines. And there was this weird one where there was just like a train for some reason behind a bowl of nectarines on a table made of ice. And the train was just kind of like snaking its way down behind the nectarines. So there's the appearance of the train in the poem. Portrait as Nectarine. They left their words and carried on. Little mixtures of what they saw, what came in sideways, darted behind the eyes and found their own disguises in what had already been left stored inside them all along. Unaccountable things, nectarines in an oak tree outside the window, growing moss green. They left their words and carried on until only the words carried on. What came out, what carried on, began coming out to carry on in ways that couldn't have been planned. A statue sent to live in the river, 3 months and 4 days isolation, sudden rain after a long dry spell, hatching magpies in the eaves. Each had their way with a bowl of nectarines. They stood at the forest mouth with a spade for a path, and then contended with the trees. 3-fruit sherbet compote. The best part of what was left might have been stolen from an advertisement from nectarines, as if you really could freeze the best taste of summer, set eager trees on a sunlit slope, and train easing grandiose towards homesteads, glad orange-yellow carriages, through its own belt of curious smoke, and a glass of frozen nectarine halves on a table made of ice. The best part of what carried on might not have belonged to them at all, but still wouldn't, without them, have carried on, taken place, taken shape, taken up that little space. And though the overall mood of the poem might recall a tree, when the eyes wind inside it, they reveal, strangely, in a way that can't be adequately accounted for, the shape of someone high in the leaves. Someone else was with them. The one who stayed and carried on after they stopped and were gone. It puts us in the curious position of one who can see what, sitting at a desk, watching out of the corner of the eye, A train pushing its blunt nose between the leaves of a tree and a bowl of nectarines on a mantle, they couldn't. How, against the tree, its moss-green leaves and a sunlit slope in memory, they were flickering with glances. Each glance a glance less, a small part of them that reached out and reaching out left a little less. How they would be outlived by their own glances, and so how the oak's flickering hem was the pale flickering of them. Like paper cuts in the tissue of air, we might momentarily smell sweet nectarine in their hair and feel the urge across the years to cross the years and sit beside them to bandage the wounds of their diminishing eyes. There would be nothing to do but sit as you do now beside them, fit warm disguises to the silence for them to carry into silence. Here is a portrait with smooth red and yellow skin that takes and lets you take reflections, a few more of the rations of your glances, and a nectarine frozen in a bowl, like the warm taste of summer. Thanks.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Chad. So I'm going to ask you to step back for a bit, and I'm
Sure.
going to introduce Francis and Joe.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So we'll start the reading with Francis Leveston. Francis has published 2 collections of poetry, Public Dream, which appeared in 2007 and which was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and Disinformation, which was published in 2015 and which was shortlisted for the International Dylan Thomas Award. Her first book of short stories, The Voice in My Ear, was published by Jonathan Cape last year. She is a senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Manchester and lives in Northumberland. Welcome, Francis.
Hi, Carmen. Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks, everyone. Chad, thank you for that fantastic reading. I'm looking forward so much to reading the new book. I really loved Chad's first collection, and that has got me very excited for the new collection. So yeah, really, really good to hear those poems. I'm doing that dangerous thing of sort of slightly ditching what I had planned to read based on what has come up in the conversation already. I have a poem called Midsummer Loop. And since it's such a gorgeous summery day today, and we've been talking about time loops already, I thought I would read that, and then I'll read a couple of newer pieces. So this poem is a single sentence. It's a single sentence that kind of goes back to the beginning of itself at the end. So you could, if you were so inclined, read the poem forever. And it is about attending a conference and then at a certain point staggering out of the conference and looking at something entirely different, and sort of an enormous sense of relief of looking at something very different there. Okay, Midsummer Loop. Now in the stillness, the 2 still hours between this meeting and that, hours of silence in which the angel of conversation deserts us to beat her wings above another gathering, another long room, magnificent table, and solemn pronouncement made to the detriment of everybody else, and the glorification of the subject. Now we are abandoned to our own resources on this one original summer's day, and 2 hours fill like stones with the heat of the afternoon, 2 flat stones placed on the stomach to steady the heartbeat and the breathing. A number of rabbits emerge from their secret holes hidden about campus, hidden but not undiscoverable holes, down in the beginnings of dry holly bushes out of season, and the naked wooden roots of rhododendrons, from which the rabbits hop forward, 1 hop at a time, 1 a minute, 100 little clepsydras, all set to different schedules, forward onto the grass, where they balance, weightless as empty pelts, on the points of the blades, like martial artists who lie unharmed on beds of nails, conducting their spiritual business. With 2 hot stones weighing down their bodies, lightly, painlessly, rabbits fanning out across the sweeps of grass that sustain them, across the blades that do not bend beneath them, where they eat with endless hunger and fanatical devotion, clipping flat the sharp tips precisely with ordinary curved discoloured teeth again and again, masticating the strands as they cross and recross the blocks of dark gold sun laid across the lawns like golden doors through which we cannot pass, through which they pass unharmed, both ears laid flat like banked canoes, and their great hind legs gentle and relaxed, white scuts bobbing quietly across the campus, which is also their campus, attached as rabbits are attached to their shadows, to a vast university, invisible underground, the one ours mirrors, intricate halls of residence and studios, round which the rabbits conduct themselves in absolute darkness by touch and smell alone, the wordless sensitivities of their whiskers brushing the walls and other warm bodies, all thrilling to an offensive discharge of fear in the air, undetectable to the human who feels so pleased to have spotted 2 rabbit holes there at the foot of that blossoming tree. Now in the stillness, the 2 still hours between this meeting and that. So that's from my second book, Disinformation, which has this fantastic pink cover, which is a painting by an artist called Wayne Sleeth. But I realised recently, when we finally managed to get our hands on a copy of the My Bloody Valentine album Loveless on vinyl, finally, which is really hard to get hold of, I realised it looks like that. And that must just be an image I've carried with me since I was a teenager from listening to that record. So I'll read a tiny poem from that. There's quite a lot of poems in this book that are engaging with mythology or thinking about the kind of the figure of the god, or particularly the goddess, as really just a way of thinking about the kind of forces that arrange our reality in the contemporary moment as well as classically. And this is a little poem about that called The Golden Age. In the Golden Age, we communed with gods. A god could be hidden, barely contained, inside the costumes of normal men. Nothing was certain. How could you refuse a beggar's request or a gambler's wager, the bold advance of the boss's only daughter, without fear of causing offence to a god? You would say yes. In the Golden Age, whatever was offered, you would say yes. Okay, a couple of newer poems. This first one, an animal poem to follow up on that conversation as well. I don't think this really needs any explanation. So this poem is called Venetian Fly. Your stiff tulle wings and striped lace jacket, your bulbous red chalcedony eye, wearing your little bouter mask even to eat and drink, and the crusted name, sarcophagid eye. So highly decorated you might be Murano glass crisped from the furnace, or a silver-piped papier-mâché ambassador of the 4th Pope Boniface, blown off course but undiscouraged. Here, sip this. Your legs, black threads on an undertaker's cuff. You groundsman of the dead's estate on Saint Michel, what have you come to visit me for? A sniff of death in July? Are you here for the Redentor? It's more than yogurt and cherry blood drew you off the quay. Not you, but something exactly like you will outlive you and me, and go whizzing down the Rio de San Treveso towards the Judica Sound, to lay the scary future in a tourist's open mouth. All right, one more poem. This is, I'm 99% sure, the only poem I've ever written in response to traveling somewhere to give a poetry reading. If I do this again, somebody have a word with me. I went to a small town up in the Swiss Alps called Leukerbad or Leukerbad. and was stricken with terrible hay fever the whole time I was there, but that is not what the poem is about. So the poem is called Zeno in Leukerbad, and I was trying to think about how difficult it is at times to think about climate emergency, and how you might find yourself in one of these very beautiful places and look around and it looks pristine, and you think, what is everybody worrying about? You know that it's a problem, but it's hard. It was difficult on that trip, kind of looking around myself, to feel that there was anything wrong. So the poem was originally called Unbeliever, but it's now called Zeno in Leukerbad. May or may not be a good decision. Nowhere in these wildflower shuddering meadows, mindless in the wind's demands, or the long thin waterfalls pluming off the cliffs like ponies' tails, or the cornices of snow, impossibly snow, enduring in depressions, or down the fanned folds those summits comprise, can I see what I'm told has happened already, happening in sight? Not even in spirit do I feel an ending, under the twinned swags of the cable cars and the weeping pines that map the steep slopes and encroach upon the village, so close, like this, to Rilke's grave, and rocks that Ruskin must have loved if he came this way, have loved and drawn. Persistent world. The river sprints past it, the valley crowds round, and I know what I know as well as I can say it, but never can grasp that bathers pummeled by pearly jets in geothermal pools, tilting their chins to the sun, will not keep bobbing for 1,000 years to come, their naked shoulders colouring and colouring like roses, but never quite burned. Thanks very much.
Oh, love the new poems, Frances.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing those. Okay, so our next reader is Joe Carrick Vardy. Joe is a British-Irish writer who lives in London. He is the author of 2 pamphlets, the most recent of which is 54 Questions for the Man Who Sold a Shotgun to My Father, which deserves some kind of prize just for the title. Joe is a book reviewer for the PN Review and co-founder of the online poetry magazine Bath Mag. Joe?
Thank you, Carmen, for that introduction. Yeah, I just want to say big up Chad, large up Chad today. I'm really likewise with Frances, having listened to your poems now, I'm really excited about the book. I've read a few of them online here and there, but I can't wait to get my hands on it soon. I'm just going to read 3 relatively short poems. I'm kind of aware, I have this real bad preoccupation that my poems are really, really depressing. And the worst thing to do would be to come and read at someone's launch and read depressing poems. I think that would be an objectively bad decision. So I've gone through my poems and I've tried to find poems that aren't, well, the least depressing ones, which kind of wipes out everything I've written. But I've got 3 poems here. The first of which is called Ryan Gosling. And it's part of a sequence that I'm working on at the moment called Ryan Gosling. And every poem in the sequence is called Ryan Gosling. Ryan Gosling. But Ryan Gosling will die one day, and the trees are more than certain he will die driving, covered in tattoos and his body and the corrugated wind. Last summer, Ryan and I played a game with the trees. We decided they were well aware of our bullshit, the fact we shouldn't have been driving, Ryan changing gear, and the click, click, grr as the engine held its breath, which Ryan would come to tell me was merely the sound of matter changing place, like when a blue whale yawns and the lights go out in a school hall, or like the time I got a salary job and my father called me middle class and I was sure that nothing would change. Sip of water. So I've recently been doing some research on lemmings, specifically the myth around lemmings that they are suicidal animals, and that when they migrate, they en masse jump off cliffs because they're trying to get across the water, and they jump off cliffs in herds. And I found out that actually that myth was created by Disney, and Disney did a documentary in 1958 called White Wilderness, in which they threw a herd of lemmings off a cliff and filmed it. And that's where the myth came from, which is absolutely bonkers. But this poem has anything to do with that, but it has in the moment, in the poem, there is a reference to this documentary, and not many people know about it. So I thought I should tell you. This poem is called "What If Suicide is Just Taking Off Your Headphones?" What if suicide is just taking off your headphones? Said the blue whale to the lemming. I think you need to take a walk at the lemming. But I've been walking all year. Last week I was in the Arctic watching an ice shelf. The lemming regarded the blue whale. Did you know glacier water is blue because it contains no oxygen? Stop trying to change the subject. Glacier water contains no oxygen because in glaciers, the pressure causes air to be squeezed out, increasing the density of the ice. The blue whale creaked like a train. A glacier lake appears blue because it absorbs other colors more efficiently than blue. That doesn't really explain anything, said the blue whale. The lemming sucked teeth. I'm only trying to G you up. The blue whale remembered being a chubby year 7, asking Emmy Strachan out over text. My arms are T-Rex arms. My hands are open lemons. The lemming considered telling the blue whale the anecdote about its family who jumped off a cliff in a Disney documentary, but instead the lemming cupped its palm to the blue whale's nose and held it there for a few seconds. Then the lemming kissed the blue whale's cheek, which, for reference, was the size of a church window, so the lemming had to stand on tiptoes. And like that, the pair became best friends, and the blue whale promised to carry the lemming on its back wherever they wanted to go, and this is how islands were made. So a little sip of water. So one more poem, tiny little poem to finish off. This poem is called Lop Nor, and the poem, for those of you that don't know, Lop Nor is a massive salt lake in China that dried up, and no one knows why it dried up. Lop Nor. My father dives headfirst into a lake, swims till his pink shoulders become stars. He swims for days, beach to beach. The pink shoulders of my father's stars are attached to other stars by invisible rope. Birds perch on them, cranes and gulls and bony blue herons appear at 6 a.m. from behind the mountain, slipping like moons, the more you look. My head first dives no match. Feel the gulp that's coming, barnacle-chinned, the birds inexplicably lifting. Thank you very much for listening.
Oh, Joe, what terrific poems. That lemming poems. It's just a winner. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'm going to bring Chad back so I can ask him to read one more poem. So Chad, I gave you a list of poems that I recommended you read. You read a few of them, but yeah. I'm going to ask that you read Funk Island, which is one of my favorite poems in the book.
Funk Island, sure, yeah.
And then before you read it, I'd like you to explain where the poem comes from, like why you wrote it. You know.
Yeah, sure. I was, doing a lot of really cheery reading on just like the history of extinction. And so I got to know the auks, which were a sort of flightless bird, a lot like a penguin, that used to sort of occupy a territory between Norway and Newfoundland. And it was this kind of, I guess, weird moment in history where they were hunted to extinction, but like none of it was hidden in sort of, factories or slaughterhouses or that kind of thing. It was just sailors going out looking for the ox. And a lot of the sailors kept these really detailed and often kind of poetic journals of what it was like hunting these birds. So Funk Island is an island just off the coast of Newfoundland. And that was one of the spots where some of the last auks were hunted. And there's, I think, actually like a little statue in Newfoundland of just like one metal auk, sort of like looking over a river. So this poem is sort of about the auks and also just about the sailors.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
Okay. Funk Island. Funk Island. It gets cold late summer on Funk Island. A man takes 2 auks from a stone pen, retreats to his cauldron, and breaks their body into sticks to kindle his fire. This is not industry, not the gear of some machine chugging cold shadows that walk into walls and never come back. This is night on Funk Island, as black feathers unhook in water, and no vision, where fate appears starkly as if in paint, has ever visited us like it visited the half-skinned ox looking back over the aisle at what the fire cast, the outline of a man boiling them as if they'd last to the last. Thanks.
Thank you, Chad. Okay, so now we are officially in the question and answer period of the launch. I would invite everyone watching this to please pop in a question if you can. We seem to have a few comments, but nothing usable in terms of a few usable questions. I mean, as questions. So if you have any questions, please put them where you need to put them so we can see them. But I also want to invite Francis and Joe on screen, because I had asked them to prepare a question for Chad to sort of start us off. So I will invite Francis to begin.
Sure. This was my question, but I've just seen Zach Wells in the comments has said, love how you work repetitions, Chad. And I was just thinking about that, listening to your poems, and particularly the ending of Funk Island just then, that the orcs would last to the last. And there were various other moments where kind of a word comes up and then a line or half a line or 2 lines later, the word recurs, but at a different angle. And this lovely sense of kind of, well, I guess it's looping again, isn't it? But looping and coming back from a different angle, so that the word seems to turn and the implications of it change.
It's almost as though the poem itself has a memory. Going back to this idea of memory, and it sort of there isn't the sense that, sorry, I don't want to sort of preempt how you're going to answer this, but there isn't the sense.
This is good. Keep going, Carmen.
There isn't the sense, this does happen in poems where like the poem sort of hurdles line to line, and of course you want to sort of prioritize surprise and newness, and so this looping quality in your poems is different. The poem kind of loops back and remembers what it said and sort of rings changes on it in a way. Does that strike you as plausible as an answer?
Yeah, I mean, it does, and I think that's fairly close to sort of, what I was thinking, as much as I was thinking anything while I was writing these poems. But I think that, once I started to have maybe 15 or 20 pages together, I just sort of noticed that that's something that the poems were doing, that they were kind of recycling and looping bits of language. And then I guess I just decided that I wanted to lean into that and make that sort of a bit of a feature of the book. I just really sort of liked the way that it sounded and the way that it kind of contributed to just the soundscape of the poems. And then particularly at the end, having some kind of repetition or often some kind of like buried rhyme there as well. But frankly, I was just stealing that from R.F. Langley. And trying to work that into the poems. Yeah,
that's good, because he passed away, right? So there's no copyright issues there at all.
What's that? Yeah, no, I'm fine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. But it's funny that you picked that up, Francis, because I noticed repetition in your poems quite a bit too, particularly in the rabbit poem that you read. You do sort of.
Yeah, I mean, and that it's more kind of a way of just not letting the sentence end.
Yeah.
Whereas I felt like there was something more metaphysical, I guess, going on with, which like at times is a slightly riddling quality, isn't it? Which I really enjoy.
Joe, do you have a question?
I do, yeah. So it's about the title of the book, and I have kind of my own theories about nectarines. I think I don't actually understand what a nectarine is. I used to think they were created in the 1930s in a lab because they're like a cross between a peach and a plum.
Yeah.
But I recently found out that maybe that's wrong and they're actually like 2,000 years old. So I was wondering, one, do you know when or where nectarines were made, and why did you call the book Nectarine?
Okay, so I have no idea what nectarines are or where they come from. I should definitely brush up on that before someone else asks me that question. Yeah, and you know, like that poem Portrait as Nectarine was like probably one of the last things that I wrote that got into the collection. And it was again, like, it was just me looking at these like weird 1940s through 60s advertisements for nectarines. And there was just like something about this like really sweet, bright fruit sitting on top of like a table, like that was made out of ice. And I think like the advertisement's like tagline was something like "Freeze the best taste of summer." And I guess there was just something that kind of chimed about that idea and a lot of the poems in the book. Like this idea that there is still like a kind of tangible like warmth and color like trapped in memory and the past that we can kind of contact, I guess. But now I just really want to know where nectarines come from.
Awesome.
I mean, it's funny that you bring up the title, because it was definitely one of the more controversial aspects of our editing. There were a number of titles we looked at. I really liked that one, and I liked it mostly because of the surprise of it. After the first book, which was very tormented in very outward ways. Like Chad's first book is a very troubling and troubled book. I mean, it's sort of beautiful and spectacular in terms of its language, but also something that's very dark, and there is darkness in this new book, but there is also a kind of like, I don't know, a kind of turn, a kind of not happiness exactly, but a kind of the sense of looking at things in fullness and with confidence, and I thought Nectarine captured the kind of surprise I felt reading it, and it's definitely one of the things people mention most about the book. It's proven to be, at least from a marketing perspective, quite interesting, because people remember the title. And the first question they ask is, why is this book about? Why did you call it Nectarines? And as the fact that there's a question for me is great. And even if there isn't really a very satisfying answer to it for people, but having people react to the book, even in surprise and even slight confusion, is better than sort of 90% of the way people react to titles, which is, of course, it's a book of poems. So it worked out that way. But it also, like, Nectarine does tune into the title poem and the way that the fruit is used in that poem. So there is a credible reason for using it, aside from the fact that I just like the word. And I was able to convince Chad into using it. So I think we have 3 questions. So Jen's gonna pop them up.
Oh, and Carmine, I just want to take a second and just like thank Joe and Francis for their readings. Yeah. I just couldn't be happier to have them reading tonight, and it was great to hear the new work. So like, thank you both so much for being here. Yeah.
And congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
congrats. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
That's from Zach Wells. Chad, you say you moved away from research, but it sounds to me like you shifted the focus and manner of research. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. So I think for Laws and Locks, it was kind of research first, and then the poems would sort of come out of that. So like I would make a lot of notes and then start to sort of like lift and pull and change lines, from the research. And this time around, I would kind of leave the research for the sort of like the very late stages of writing a poem. So I wanted the poems, I think, to come from like my own reactions and impressions first, and then to see if there was anything in the research that that could sort of help the poems move along. So yeah, I think I just kind of like I might have like flipped the process a little bit for these poems, I think. Yeah.
Lucy Burns, thanks for all the great readings. Question for Chad: what are you working on at the moment? Next, that's a good question, Chad. What are you what are you doing?
Yeah, that is a good question.
Other than your PhD.
That's an excellent question, Lucy, who I know is sitting on a couch with my friend Anarutha and Ellie right now watching this. So I've done something that I haven't done in 15 years, which is I have taken a break from writing poems. I kind of like launched right into writing new stuff when Laws and Locks was finished. And I think that I probably wrote maybe 2 full collections between Laws and Locks and Nectarine. And I don't know, this time I kind of want to just see what comes up and what gets me back to writing poems. I've got a few drafts, but nothing specific. And all I know is that for the next collection, I want to sort of get back inside the poems a bit more myself, a bit more sort of like the lyric voice, I think, for the next one. But we'll see.
Evan Jones. Hey, Evan. Wonderful readings all. Can you say something about how biography fits into your poems? That's a good question. I mean, your first book was far more autobiographical.
Yeah.
Biographical and autobiographical. I think the new one does have some bits of personal information. Although it's not that easy to find, I have to say. Like it's not offered up as transparently as the first one was.
Yeah, so there's nothing in Nectarine that was invented. I know that the sort of like the descriptor dreamlike or dreams has kind of been used in describing the poems, and like there definitely might be that quality to them, but yeah, nothing in the book was invented. It was just kind of put together in ways that like weren't necessarily 100% true to like when they happened or how they happened. And I really I didn't want myself to be the kind of like the central organizing principle of the poems. I wanted to find other centers for the poems, if that makes sense. So a lot of the poems that do that with these sort of like composite figures that are sort of like amalgams of people that I've met in different places. So like I do come into the poems sometimes, and maybe more in the elegies, where perhaps there's a bit more of like a sense that you do want to do that work of bearing witness, Yeah.
I think we have one more.
Okay.
Marjorie, good to see you. Congratulations, Chad. It's an amazing book. These seem like quite solitary poems, though the first ends with the words, "Not alone but together." What are your thoughts on aloneness in poetry? That's a good question. I noticed that quite a bit in your book.
It's a good question, and like I don't know that I've got a ready answer for that one. Like these poems were almost all written between the hours of maybe 5 o'clock in the morning and like 5 and 8 in the morning. So like I would wake up every morning when it was still dark outside and just kind of write the poems as the room was kind of like getting sketched in by the light outside the window. And there was something I think about that, like that sense of the world being kind of like filled in, almost like colored in as I was writing the poems, that did give me this feeling like I was like, floating alone somewhere on my desk writing these poems. But I like to think at least that these poems are also kind of like my like reaching out toward the world. There are a couple of poems that talk about dividing the aloneness, and this kind of sense of like the poem, that the poet leaves behind and then is picked up by a reader, that it becomes this kind of common ground, this kind of like shared moment. So I suppose that, like poetry as a way of dividing aloneness was somewhere there in the background as I was writing these. Yeah.
I actually think we have one more question. Jeffrey Carr, the discussion has been interesting. Your reference to a glance is quite cool. What guides what you are compelled to pay attention to in a glance?
It's actually like one thing I really enjoyed about writing these poems was that I actually didn't feel like like I went out hunting for things that sort of like grabbed my attention or grabbed my glance, so to speak. Like I would just kind of look back over what I'd been doing and where I'd been recently. And it was almost like I felt like it was like sifting for gold or something. Like I would just find these couple of moments that seemed to just kind of stick. And then the poems were like my way of just like writing into those moments, writing into those glances. And so like it really did have this feel of almost like taking an image or taking just like a glance of an experience and then doing my best to kind of like grow that to a size of a poem. If that makes any sense.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that wraps it up. Do we have a winner for the giveaway? Zach Wells. That's great. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks to you all for joining us. Thanks to Francis and Joe for being a part of this and sharing their poems with us. Thanks to Chad.
Thank you.
Book. Don't forget to visit the Véhicule Press website to buy a copy of the book. And want to wish everyone a happy summer. See you all again in the fall.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.